Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely. With me today, of course, is co-founder of the Gaggle, Peter Lavelle, and we are once again very fortunate to welcome Geoff Shepard. He's been on the Gaggle a number of times before. He's one of the world's foremost expert on Richard Nixon, the Nixon presidency, the Nixon years, and the aftermath of the Nixon years. So I thought it would be a very interesting now to discuss particularly the Trump era and compare it to the Nixon era, because some of the problems that Donald Trump is now running into were very similar to the problems that Richard Nixon ran into, because Richard Nixon came into the White House and presided over a federal bureaucracy that had been forged in the FDR, Truman, Kennedy, Johnson years. He knew that it would be very hostile to him. He knew the judiciary would be very hostile to him. He tried to get around it. He built up his own team, the Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Kissinger, to get around the federal bureaucracy. In the end, he failed. So, Geoff, do you see these parallels between the Nixon and the Trump presidencies?
Well, I certainly do, George, and it's good to be back with you. And it is an understatement to say that Nixon failed. It was a total wipeout. I think unfairly, because among my many characteristics, I am probably the preeminent critic of the Watergate prosecutions. I lived through it. I've done a lot of research. I think they fudged. But let's compare Nixon and Trump with two caveats. Mark Twain is credited with saying history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Now they don't know when he said it, but they credit him for that. So we're going to talk about parallels, but they're not exact. It's reminiscent of what Nixon did. And your listeners should know, I consider myself to be a very knowledgeable commentator on the Nixon years. I do not hold myself out to be a knowledgeable commentator on the Trump situation.
No one is at this point. No one.
Absolutely. I've done no research. I read the paper. I'm intrigued because I do know what happened 50 years ago. So let's start with a comparison of the two men, and we're really going back to 2016. Both won narrow victories. Were not expected to prevail. Both came into Washington opposed by every institution in the nation's capital. Trump did take the Congress, but not by much. Trump was an inexperienced politician, a very experienced businessman. Nixon was a very experienced politician and inexperienced businessman. Both were very thin-skinned, were attacked viciously by their opponents. Then you come forward a little bit. Nixon knew what he wanted to do and knew who the people were he wanted in place. And he nominated and appointed people to his White House staff that had not favored him in the election. Kissinger was Rockefeller's guy. The head of the Fed, he was president of Columbia University, and he didn't think Nixon was conservative enough. I'm blocking on his name, but the pipe-smoking, white-haired...
Was it Arthur Burns?
Arthur Burns. And George Shultz was head of the University of Chicago Business School, but not really political, not seen as political. And those people, and Daniel Patrick Moynihan was a Harvard professor. But Nixon was so certain of his own interests and abilities and what he wanted to accomplish, he wanted different points of view around him. And he wasn't all loyal all the time. Now, switch a little bit to President Trump. When he first came in, he didn't know anybody. He took other people's advice on who to appoint. He was pretty sure of his goals, but not at all sure how to get there. And it was chaotic presidency because the press was so opposed. Nixon was more knowledgeable in how you played the game. Then you go forward to each of their re-elections. Trump has time off, but the re-elections, Nixon's is an absolute landslide, credited by many to be the greatest election victory in our nation's history. Took 49 states, lost only Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. Trump barely won election or re-election, but he took all 7 swing states, and I think it's fair to say that the victory was decisive. He outperformed Republican senators in the states that he was going against. He's got a much better handle on what he wants to accomplish. But this time, because of his experience in the first term, he wants competence, but loyal competence.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of these interesting things. I was watching a couple of people. I don't want to go into the intricacies of the Gaza situation. That's for another time. But it's well known. It's very clear that a lot of almost all of the people to a person that he has brought on board around him are very pro-Israeli. But it seems to me, given his experience in his first term, he will listen to these people, but it doesn't necessarily mean he's going to take their advice. I think, he will just say, well, okay, but this is what we're going to do. I think obviously he feels very burned, okay? And of course, he doesn't take any responsibility for it.
Of course not. No, of course not.
Of course not. But, let's do one that's much closer to George and I, is the whole Ukraine thing. I mean, all these people were, neocons or, pro-Ukraine, whatever. But then Trump just stomped his foot, and look at Marco Rubio, and he's just nodding his head. Okay, yes, sir, yes, sir. It seems to me that, I mean, echoing what you were just saying there, he wants loyalty, he wants competence, but that mixture is only going to make sense to him. Okay,
yeah, he's very much in charge. He's not blindly following along behind somebody. And Nixon was very much in charge. The tapes show that Kissinger was the student.
Yep.
Yeah.
Nixon exactly. Was the leader, and it's not what was portrayed in the press.
No, absolutely.
And the press are saying, well, it's Elon Musk. Elon Musk is really the co-president, but he's not. His interests and abilities coincide with Trump's needs. He's fun to have around.
Sure.
But Trump is very, very much the president. And like Nixon, he's in a real hurry. Nixon would wake up each morning with a list of things and be pulling and tugging on his people. We got to get this done. Time is a wasting where we're letting our opponents dictate the field of battle. We can't do that. We've got to proceed. Now, Trump is doing it with a vengeance. But go back. I have a mental list of comparisons. Let me run them down real quick. Both were comeback presidents.
Mm-hmm.
Both essentially outsiders to the elites and the establishments. Hard to picture Nixon as an outsider, but in that era, Californians were nuts. That was, it wasn't seen as the elite. It was seen as balancing Eisenhower's ticket when he was chosen to be vice president.
Yeah.
Both are characterized by congressional hearings. And Nixon's was the Irvin Committee. I mean, the trials are not televised if they're federal trials. So you get the news coverage. The news media is uniformly against both, the mainstream media, uniformly against both presidents. People who tell you they know about Watergate, well, they know what the hearings were by the Senate Irvin Committee. And the Senate Irvin Committee was dominated by Democrats. There was only 7 people, but critically, there were 4 Democrats and 3 Republicans. The J6 committee, January 6th committee, is roughly the counterpart. It was dominated by Democrats. There are 2 purported Republicans, but they weren't chosen by Republican leadership. And interestingly, in both situations, both filmed, both dominant coverage by the media, both featured a turncoat. Now, turncoat's it's a weighted word, someone who was against the president's position. There was no one on J6 who was in favor of Trump. None, zero, no representation at all. But most importantly, there was Liz Cheney, who was his avowed enemy. Okay, nominally a Republican, but not at all a Trump supporter. Well, in Watergate, it was Lowell Weicker, the senator from Connecticut. He got on the committee for the express purpose of dumping on Nixon. So it wasn't a 4-3 committee at all. It was a 5-2, and the other two weren't in favor of Nixon either.
Yeah.
Howard Baker, who was the senator from Tennessee, he wanted to run for the presidency at some point in the future. And he decided, remember, his father-in-law is Everett Dirksen, the famous politician from the generation before, senator. And Howard Baker decided, reading the tea leaves, the best position to be in was to be an inquirer of the truth. What did the president know and when did he know it? Not a Nixon advocate at all.
I remember.
So Nixon's, and of course the media is totally against Nixon, but nobody's pointing out you're only getting one point of view.
And the media loved Baker.
Oh, of course they did. Sure. He was the objective inquirer of the truth. And it wasn't that way at all. He was, as most people in Washington, he was looking out for himself. I mean, that's the whole purpose. Well, Trump's going to have something of that same problem because both are now lame ducks. And I don't think the media properly analyzes the situation of a lame duck. From the moment you are, and each on the reelection, power starts to slip away. Yeah. Washington is filled with very, very selfish people who think of themselves first. How does that affect me? How can I advance or cover myself in this situation? Right now, for most Republicans, you'd better be on Trump's side. They're taking notes, they're taking names, they have long memories. But over time, that's going to fade. And you're going to get renegades. You're going to get people who say, I'll get more coverage. I'll get more coverage if I start to put a little distance between me and him. So he's got maybe a year.
George and I have a theory that Marco Rubio is going to be the first to do that.
I'm a domestic affairs guy, Peter. I don't follow foreign affairs with the expertise.
Well, I mean, okay, go ahead, George.
No, but there were certain things that that we remember from the Nixon era, which really are making a big impact today. Well, first, remember, Nixon did this impoundment. He just simply said, okay, this is money impounded by Congress, or appropriated by Congress. I'm not going to spend it.
Right.
This infuriated Congress, and then they passed. I think it was already after he was gone. They passed that. I can't remember the title of that act.
Yeah, the Impoundment Rejection Act.
Whatever it is.
Yeah.
But this is what Trump is going for. This this is he's absolutely targeting the same way that Nixon did, which is I'm not going to be the sort of the rubber stamp for Congress. I have final discretion over how money is spent, and this is enraging Congress, and that's going to be a very interesting battle. It'll go all the way to the Supreme Court whether a president can do this.
And do that. Now let's stick on that for a second. Our head of government affairs, a guy named Bill Timmons, the legislative part of the White House staff that lobbied the Congress, in analyzing how things had gone, how you work with a Democrat majority. One of Nixon's problems was he controlled neither house of Congress. What Bill would say was, well, you can get along just fine if you don't challenge their prerogatives, because they get really upset if you challenge their prerogatives. And it was Harry Byrd of West Virginia, who was the scholar in the Senate. There were others in the House. There's this guy. He's not particularly well known. His name is Russ Voigt, and he's head of the Office of Management and Budget. Now, we put OMB together. We're the ones that created it to enable the president in his executive office of the presidency to control the executive branch. Millions of people. You say go left, and the bureaucracy says, well, think about it. Maybe we didn't hear you. Maybe you didn't mean left. Maybe you meant right. The deep state, almost impossible to move. So Voigt comes in, and he was the OMB director in the first term. And I've watched him on Tucker Carlson. Excuse me. And he takes the position that there have been amazing encroachments on presidential power. He says starting right after Watergate, because the presidency was so weak. I say starting with Watergate. And Voigt's point is, appropriations are the ceiling, not the floor. If they set aside $100,000 to build a frigate, and you can build it for $50,000, you don't have to spend the other 50. That's not the deal. The executive gets to choose. Same thing with people. This nonsense about independent agencies that the president can't fire, or people appointed like the FBI or the head of the Fed for a term of years, and the president can't interfere. Voigt says that's just nonsense. That's not in the Constitution. The president runs the executive branch. Everybody in the executive branch works for him. And if you don't do what my president says, Donald Trump, we're going to fire your tail. And they run out and they find some liberal judge appointed by the Democrats who's willing to say, no, you don't have that ability. You don't have, remember, there's this case. Now, I'm going to mention the case because I love it. It's Morrison v. Olson. And it's a long, long time ago. It's 8-1. And the one is Scalia. And Justice Scalia said that of all of his years on the Supreme Court, the one decision he was most troubled by was this relatively unknown decision in Morrison v. Olson that said a special prosecutor who the president didn't control was not necessarily too much of an infringement on his prerogatives as president. Now, in the years since, scholars will tell you they don't think it's good law anymore, because after Morrison v. Olson came the Clinton stuff and that impeachment. And where you find this going both ways, you find a lot of academics, law professors, saying, Article 1 sets up the legislature. It's preeminent. It's the power of the purse. But Article 2 has no constraints. But it's a presidency in one person, and that one person has authority. Well, we're going to test all of that. What we put together with OMB, it's really interesting. You've got absolute control in OMB. Congress cannot spend a dime without OMB's concurrence. When they say stop, you got to stop. Now, the effectuator is the Treasury, but we'll see. They discovered the check register, and they're going through saying, did you know we spent money for this, money for this, money for this? What fun. Nixon never discovered that stuff. But in creating OMB, you can't, no department can issue a regulation without OMB's approval. In the Department of Justice, no department, no agency, no group of people in the executive can come into court and represent their agency except by and through the Department of Justice. So you've got this behemoth, the executive branch, but we have certain controls in DOJ, in Treasury, and at OMB. When you go to testify on legislation, we haven't gotten into the legislative battles, but they'll come. An agency can go up on the Hill and testify in favor or opposition, whatever. But their testimony has to be cleared by the Office of Management and Budget. And what that did was change what used to be called cabinet government. President appointed a cabinet. They pretty much ran their departments. President picked 3 or 4 things he was concerned about, usually foreign affairs, and everybody got along. But the president's power was very muted. OMB consolidated that in what's called the Executive Office of the President. And you had the revitalized National Security Council, the newly created Domestic Council that's now called the Domestic Policy Council, and the Office of Management and Budget. And those 3 agencies took over the projection of presidential power. So ever since, the agencies have input, but the president makes the policy decision, and then the departments and agencies effectuate it. And it's what enabled us to keep up. Those 3 improvements, NSC, Domestic Council, OMB, laid the foundation for the modern presidency. Now, Trump's people know that. He's got people in charge that have been there, done that, and they know what he wants. And there's this new description, flooding the zone, where they're just going and going and going and going. They're not going to stop.
Okay, Geoff, this may sound a whimsical question for you. What do you think Nixon would think of Trump?
What do you think Trump thinks of Nixon?
I think Trump. No, I think Trump rather admires Nixon. I think Trump knew Nixon in later years.
He met him, but it was before Trump had apparent aspirations. Trump is ambivalent about Nixon. He respects his knowledge, his insights, particularly his foreign affairs expertise. Trump doesn't have those things in government. But he's also said he quit. I never would have quit. He didn't fire enough people. He trusted his people too long. He should have been prepared to clean house much sooner, and he wouldn't have been in the same amount of trouble. I've had really knowledgeable people tell me privately, Nixon would have survived if he hadn't been so cheap. He didn't hire his own lawyer. I mean, he used government employees to protect him. And in academic circles, in the great scheme of things, government employees represent the office and not the man. So if you're counsel to the president, and everybody has one, they may have a larger staff these days, but that is to service the position of office of the presidency, not the man. Trump is dozens of lawyers. Trump is in a much better position, of course, to defend himself. Now, the savaging of Donald Trump far exceeds what was done to Nixon, partially because what was done to Nixon succeeded. Nixon had virtually no defenders. I mean, I was functioning as deputy counsel, but the Department of Justice washed their hands of us. I mean, they would not protect, were not willing to come into court. Elliot Richardson, who was the very highly respected attorney general, he gave the pie away when he agreed to the special prosecutors. And the special prosecutors hired 100 people, almost all Nixon haters. And they had complete freedom, unreviewed freedom to bring any charges, launch any investigation, do anything they wanted. And they said in their first press conference, they would investigate every single allegation made against the Nixon administration from the time it first took office. No, sometimes I say this is like having 100 mothers-in-law that don't like you, each of whom can ask you questions, about your background. Who did you date in high school? When did you first notice girls? What have you done lately for my daughter? Well, that with the power to prosecute. And of course, what we've seen today is with a lot of money, $100 million cost Trump to defend himself against savage attacks in 5 different jurisdictions, and he only wins if he runs the table. The federal charges are now gone. It looks like the Georgia charges are hanging by a thread. It's just New York. And here's New York. It's his state.
Yeah.
This is where he grew up. This is where he was successful. The man in the street, the police and the blue collar workers, they love him. And the elites hate him. I mean, we just had this Eric Adams development, and it's so funny because there is another point of view. You may not know it, you may not know where to find it, but when the Biden appointed U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York indicted Adams, there was a lot of criticism that it was a grandstand, that it wasn't any different from what lots of other people had done, and that he was paving the way for his own run for office. And so Trump comes in and says, I've tasted that whip too. This is no fair. It's not even clear to me if Trump said anything about Adams. It is entirely possible, don't know, it's entirely possible that the Department of Justice on its own said this is the wrong case and withdrew it. Well, the media's going crazy.
Yeah.
Just absolute crazy.
One of the parallels I think is interesting with Nixon and Trump is that elite politicians, they tend to look at what we say these days, narratives. The political.
We call them false narratives.
Yeah, or false. I mean, just like the ideology of Trump, right wing, all this stuff that is just such white noise. What I think is interesting, I don't know as much about it, and when it comes to Nixon, but it seems like Trump is fundamentally trying to change government, how it works, and Nixon was very instrumental. And instead of focusing on one's political persuasion, whatever that means today, it's so muddled. It's always just an accusation, not a characterization. But it seemed like Nixon, because he understood government very, very well.
Yep.
He understood, the power of government positions and departments. That's how you start, taming the bull. Okay, Trump is doing exactly the same thing. Is that USAID they're troublemakers. Good, get rid of them.
Yeah.
The National Endowment for Democracy, they're troublemakers for us. Get rid of them. I mean, is that a parallel?
Well, and there's Russ Voigt saying, "You bet your tail." They should respond immediately to your order. You're the president, and that otherwise get rid of them. Congress cannot. You can appoint people, put them on administrative leave, and send them home, and Congress can't do that. Now he may get TROs, temporary restraining orders, from elitist judges, but they won't stand. They won't stand on appeal. It's going to be interesting to see how it shakes out.
But
Now,
this is what's interesting. I'm just go ahead. Just finish your point.
Nixon came in with a hell of a handicap, and that is he's the first president in 142 years not to control either house of Congress when he assumed office. And the numbers were terrible. It was almost that the Senate and the House were 2/3 Democrat, left over from what we call the Goldwater debacle, where it was just a wipeout. And Nixon didn't have coattails. I mean, we had what we called an ideological majority because we had Southern Democrats, but nothing close to Republican control. So Nixon's nominees, his people in his own cabinet, had to be people sufficiently moderate to be confirmable. He couldn't trust his own cabinet. I mean, they had their own interests, and they could befriend their committees on the Hill, and it didn't matter what Nixon said. So,
but that's very interesting that you say that, because when I think of the Nixon presidency, I hardly ever think of his cabinet at all.
Well, I can tell you all of them,
Right.
I know. No, no, no. But you know, it was very anomalous to other presidencies. You know, like you would have Rumsfeld, very powerful. You know, people. But when I think back, you know, I wasn't that old at the time. But when I
Yeah.
go back on the Nixon administration, I don't. You know, Spiro Agnew pops up every once
Well,
in a while.
yeah, it's
But I don't
trouble.
think of his cat. You know, William Rogers. I mean, only we know who he is today.
That's
Okay.
absolutely true. Bill was Attorney General under Eisenhower, and Nixon needed a loyal placeholder so he could run foreign affairs with Henry. What Nixon decided quite early on was he had much more flexibility in foreign affairs. The presidency was very much in charge of foreign affairs and not so much domestic. There were too many cooks to do much. Now, of his cabinet, you brought it up. George Shultz was Secretary of Labor, emerged to be head of Office of Management and Budget, then Treasury, and then under Reagan, Secretary of State, but not a gland-hatting politician. Very competent guy. I mean, George was one of the stalwarts of the administration. And so was John Mitchell. John Mitchell was a superb attorney general. He fell because of the committee to reelect the presidency, the campaign committee,
But
not
could I just
not when he was attorney general.
this is
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
wanted to raise this question about the Justice Department because what we remember from the Nixon Justice Department was that they were pursuing busing, enforced integration. That was the Nixon Mitchell Justice Department, and
Then they were opposed to busing.
but they were pursuing it. That was the Nixon Justice Department that was pursuing busing.
Oh no, you have it backwards. The courts were demanding busing.
But the Justice Department was enforcing the busing.
No. You're with all respect. The court said you could have busing to achieve racial balance, and judges would appoint themselves to actually determine where the buses went. Richmond is a perfect example. Wilmington, Delaware, a perfect example. We ran against forced busing, and we did our dead level best to stop it. Now, you had to go in, and if the judge says you got to do it this way, you got to do it that way. But we never advocated forced busing.
But for instance, all right, enforced integration. Now, Trump's father ran it was called Trump Village. Now, Trump Village was constantly in trouble with the Nixon Justice Department because they claimed that had segregated housing. He would that in Trump Village, blacks could not move in and live there. It was a long-standing fight between the Justice Department, Nixon Justice Department, and Trump's father.
Let me meet you. I'm not familiar with that. Let me meet you halfway. We successfully integrated the Southern schools in the fall of 1971. Great achievement. George Shultz thinks it's his greatest achievement. Successful, peaceful integration. And one of the ways we did it was to buy buses for the school districts in the South to be able to achieve what the Supreme Court ruled they had to achieve. That's different from out of nowhere, like in San Francisco with Kamala Harris saying, "I was one of those little girls who was bused." Well, that wasn't for integration. That was a typical San Francisco going over the wire. But I believe, and we should pursue this further. I believe we were against the concept of forced busing. We were in favor of enforcing the decisions of the Supreme Court, and we did it peacefully. And that it starts with Brown v. Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas, in 1954. And the court is saying, look, you got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do this. And the Democrats didn't do squat. And Nixon comes in, and the courts are becoming more and more insistent. And we enforced the law, but it wasn't this eagerness to have your kids bust right past the neighborhood school off to some other place. Now, I don't recall that school choice was an issue back then.
I don't think so.
But Catholic schools were sure as hell an issue. The only thing keeping the urban schools alive was the Catholic schools, because the nuns worked for free. And we were trying to get support money, books, and facilities to the Catholic school system. And the opposition was, no, that's too religious. We don't want their teachings. But even today, in lots of places, the Catholic schools, and here in Philadelphia where I live, the Quaker schools are renowned for their education. I mean, really sought after, and that's what keeps the school systems functioning. I think today Nixon would be strongly in favor of school choice, just like Trump is. It's a Republican value. Now go back to foreign affairs for a second. Again, I am not an expert, but just today I was emailing with friends from before. I still have some friends, and we were discussing Trump's innovation of saying, well, why don't we bring American capitalism into Gaza and into the Ukraine? We won't have to put soldiers there if we're bringing our expertise and our money and giving people jobs and a future through capitalism instead of U.S. might. Nobody's going to invade, we say. Nobody's going to invade a country or a location filled with Western money and capitalistic enterprises. It's even better than soldiers because it gives people a path up. Now, and I'm going to finish here because I'm on very thin ice. Go to the neocons. My understanding of what the neocons said, and this is not under Nixon, but this is later. We've got these young men with no futures. They're not a part of the government. There's no upward mobility. We have to impose democracy on those countries that have dictatorships. We can't be friends with dictators anymore. We have to impose democracy to give the middle class a chance to grow, because that's what made our country was a strong middle class. Well, hell, we had endless land, we had endless resources, we had blessed little government, and we pulled it off. But to say as Grand High Poobahs, you should adopt our ways and you'll be like us, turns out that's a fool's errand. But Trump's, it's almost, I got to stop because I'm way beyond expertise. It's almost he's in a chit chat with Netanyahu. Remember, there was a big delay. They got to talking and didn't stop. And I think Trump came up with the idea of making Gaza a resort and a wonderful place to live, like Dubai, all kinds of money, all kinds of investment. I think he came up with that idea in the middle of their conference, and Netanyahu couldn't turn him off, and decided I better go with this because he's fallen in love with his own idea.
Yeah, but it's not Trump's idea. There have been plenty of plans that have come out of Israel itself to do essentially that. Jared Kushner's plans during Trump's first administration that was there. I don't think Nixon would approve of this. I
don't think so either.
I don't think it's such an entanglement that I think that Nixon would say that is a bridge too far. And what's the ups?
It's entirely possible.
Geoff, you didn't answer Peter's earlier question. What would Nixon think of Trump?
I think he would be bemused. I think he would be insanely jealous of Trump's charisma. Picture this. You're in New York City or some urban area. You're pulling up in a building where you're going to give a speech, a lunch or a breakfast or something. The crowd's over there. Across the street, they're building some skyscraper. If it were Trump who pulled up, he'd immediately walk across the street and shoot the breeze with the hard hats, and they'd love him. They would start cheering when he came over. Nixon, and he'd be at ease, perfectly at ease. Nixon would pull up and he'd see the group and he wouldn't want to do it, but he'd know he had to do it. And so he would make himself. One of the amazing things about Nixon was his self-control. I mean, just incredible self-control. He'd walk over and he'd try to strike up conversations. Now, it turns out, unappreciated by the masses, Nixon was a very knowledgeable sports enthusiast. He loved baseball and he loved football. And he'd analyze the plays with David Eisenhower, his son-in-law. What's the best baseball team of all time, and this sort of thing. But he couldn't pull off the charisma. So I think he'd be jealous of that. I think he'd be bemused by Trump's expertise in development being brought into the government. And he'd wonder whether that would work. And in his little hideaway office, in the afternoons, he'd go over there to think and to talk with his closest associates about ideas. I think he'd take Haldeman and Ehrlichman aside, maybe Mitchell, not Kissinger, because Kissinger wouldn't be a businessman, and say, is there promise here? Can this work? What is this idea? Now, you said, well, I'm going to go back to earlier on Gaza. It may be that was Jared's position back then, but it sure wasn't in the public domain, at least never.
And it
wasn't serious enough.
Pronouncement. It wasn't a policy pronouncement.
Okay.
Jeff, do you think that Nixon would think that Trump is a conservative?
I don't think Nixon was a conservative.
Okay.
No, I really don't.
No.
Nixon was a pragmatist.
Okay.
I mean, you take the small business MESBIC, minority small business corporations, to lend money to minorities so they can start their own businesses. Big stuff under Nixon. Nobody reads about it. Nobody writes about it. But it was this idea, we have to help these people help themselves. And he wasn't a businessman, but he saw the role of business. Go back. We were talking about elites, but really the phrase we want to use is the liberal Eastern establishment. They opposed Nixon from day one, from Alger Hiss. He was hated by the establishment. Trump derangement syndrome existed under Nixon, same way. This media inflamed core hatred.
I remember, was it Art Buchwald? What was
Art
it?
Buchwald, yeah.
I read his stuff a lot.
He was funny.
He was really funny. I mean, that's what made my early adolescence very peculiar, because I was reading that, and I used to bring it to school, and people were like, "What is this?" I mean, even my teachers thought it was odd. Are your parents giving you this? I mean,
Do you remember the Herblock cartoons?
Yep.
Yes.
Well, those were nasty. Those were mean.
Vicious.
Mean.
And Nixon would say, my kids see this stuff.
Right.
Coming up out of the sewer to accept the nomination.
Right.
But one thing
that was interesting, we were just talking about Gaza and how things have changed since the Nixon era. Nixon really did believe in some kind of a just settlement in the Middle East between Israel and the Palestinians. And I think he would have said, we need a two-state solution. He himself has said in interviews that the Israelis were very unhappy with me because I pursued friendly relations with neighboring Arab states. So, he would, I think, he would be bemused by Trump and the kind of the consensus within Washington to be so wholly and unconditionally be on the side of Israel and not even take on, take an even-handed approach with the Palestinians.
I even have the images in my head of Nixon's trip to Damascus. I can still see it in my mind.
Yeah, 3 quick points. 2 about Buchwald. He said when he did his columns, it was one time through the typewriter. He never rewrote because he had to produce almost a column a day,
Yeah.
So he'd do it that way. And he said he didn't want to get to know the subjects he was making fun of because then he'd like them and he would go easier on them. And so that it's kind of interesting for columnists to think that way. When Trump met with Netanyahu and started making his pronouncements of support for Israel, he kept throwing in lines about support for the Palestinians. They live in a hellhole. Who would want to stay there? Those poor people.
Well, Geoff, if you look at it very carefully, he actually didn't. He said the people in Gaza. He didn't say Palestinians. And it
Fair
was
enough.
a lot of
Okay.
people pointed that out.
You'd pick
And
up.
they will want to leave. They will, and they will not want to come back. He never used Palestinians. He said the people there.
I stand corrected. I would point out that's a subtlety would be totally lost on me. But when I was in government before you were born, back 50 years ago, and you'd read the Washington Post or the New York Times or the news summary in the morning. If the issue was foreign affairs, I'd skip it. That's Henry's problem. If the issue was domestic issue, I'd really work on it and think about it and know all this stuff. Well, I carry that through to today.
Yeah.
I couldn't tell you in any detail the difference between Iraq and Iran. I just couldn't do it because it's not an interest. Now, I don't think there are many involved in government who are as blissfully ignorant of foreign affairs as I am, but I really am. Okay.
What would you think Nixon would think of the growth of government? Would he think that his attempts to change governance of the United States was a complete failure? Did he add to that failure? I mean, I'm a huge admirer of Richard Nixon. I mean, we're very much in the minority here. But even reading his memoirs, which of course are self-serving, every memoir is,
Yeah.
but he was actually a very deep thinker about government.
Oh, he was. He was the only president to set aside time to think every afternoon. Now, we had this group called the Ash Council. And the idea of an Ash Council, we got to make government more efficient. We got to cut through the bureaucracy and all this stuff. Their first set of recommendations had to do with the creation of the Office of Management and Budget, creation of the Domestic Council, and the bringing of policy power, into the White House itself. Their next step was reorganization of the entire executive branch, and they were going to reduce it to 4 cabinet departments. The 4 core departments the government doesn't farm out: state, justice, treasury, and defense. Those are what the government really does. And then 4 issues where the government is really doling out money. They're grant-making institutions. And that was human resources, natural resources, community resources, and economic resources. They're slightly different titles. But we actually proposed legislation at the end of the first term. Its 1971 State of the Union was based on that, based on this total reorganization to make the executive branch more efficient. Congress wouldn't even touch it because it interfered with their power and their iron law of federal organizations. The Congressional Committee, the little teeny agency that benefits from it, and the little teeny group of applicants that get the money and spend on their personal hobbies. And we could never break the iron triangle. So what Doge is doing has its background. They got better people, a bigger sense of urgency. Nixon, in the beginning of the second term, tried to impose his reorganization plan by executive order. He had it all set up. Now, if you did it today, you'd add the Department of Homeland Security. So there'd be 5 core government functions. But I think there'd still be the same 4. And they'd go through it and they would allocate where should this agency really be. There should be a kind of a mother hen concept where the real concern was health and human services or health, education, and welfare. But you put these little side agencies in that bucket, so you had cohesive policy making and control. That's what Trump's trying to do.
Do you think I'm rapidly running out of time. Do you think that the deep state has accepted Trump?
No, I think they're terrified. They're not sure every day whether they still have a job. I think they are terrified. And being that worried causes uh, risky decisions. They had this lady on air from USAID saying, "Oh, we took down all the flags, we got rid of books that show our true feelings," and they're going through and they're reading the recipients of these grants. I mean, you couldn't write this yourself if you sat out. And the Democrats come in fat, dumb, and happy, and they're defending those grants. And they go into court and say, "Oh my God, a child will starve if you shut this flow off. That it must continue to go. We do not recognize there's been an election." And they get some judge and they say, "Well, preserve the status quo."
Okay.
In the status quo, we get to keep shoveling this money out the door, and nobody gets to say no. And they find judges who say, "Yep, oh, you bet. While we take a year to think about this, that money has to continue to go out, awarded by civil servants, no politicians. The election is irrelevant." And you're sitting there saying that, that ain't going to hold.
But Nixon himself was very frustrated, like the CIA. He felt he had no control at all over the CIA. He would just issue instructions to
Well,
Helms, and Helms would just simply ignore him. Same with the FBI.
absolutely.
I mean, Hoover would just ignore him.
Well, I mean, I don't think Hoover fit in the same category as Helms. Hoover was senile. Hoover had stayed way too long, and he was terrified of doing anything that would embarrass his agency that he devoted his life to. And when Hoover was good, Hoover was really good. But the difficulty is, from Hoover's point of view, and this is just the FBI, if they decided you were a subversive, you had no rights. The Bill of Rights didn't apply to you. And it started with Germans and Japanese in World War II. And then it switched to communists. And then it switched, unfortunately, to civil rights activists. And he thought they were all communists, particularly Martin Luther King. And then it got onto women's libers. If you weren't around, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, these women are asserting self-interest and rights.
I remember.
And telling their husband that their husband's got no say in this. They're going to go start their own business. They're going to go march. They're going braless. We're going to parade. And Hoover says, "Oh, these are all subversives." And then it was the anti-war activists. So the FBI went sour. Now, the CIA had a totally different attitude. Helms was head, but Helms was very much in charge. And when Nixon left office, there were three things he knew for sure. We were going to invade Cuba. We had missiles in Turkey aimed at Moscow, and they damn well knew it. And our biggest ally in Southeast Asia was President Diem. 8 years later, he comes back in. We've promised Cuba we won't invade. The missiles are gone from Turkey, and Diem's been assassinated. And he takes Helms aside and says, I'd really like to know what happened. I was vice president. I knew everything. I'm now president. I want to know what happened. Helms says, very nicely, very politely, "We serve one administration at a time. We don't share secrets." And Nixon said, "That's nuts. I'm president. You can't tell me I can't know." But he never learned. Helms waited him out.
Well, Geoff, this was a really fascinating trip down memory lane. Always such a pleasure to have you. And we didn't even wallow in Watergate today. So,
No, we didn't, but it was a good time. Let me tell you.
so thank you, Geoff.
Thank you.
And we look forward to having you back again very soon. Thank you. And remember, if you like the Gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye-bye.